Sacred Heart ER in Raleigh smells like antiseptic and burnt coffee at 3 in the morning. Danielle Ross moves through the trauma bay with the kind of precision that goes unnoticed by attending physicians, the way she positions herself at 45 degrees to the gurney, how her eyes scan for hemorrhage before the resident even speaks, the efficiency of her hand movements when she runs and fall line in under 30 seconds while the med students are still pulling on gloves. She's been a float pool nurse here for 3 years. Nobody has ever asked why she doesn't apply for charge nurse positions. Nobody has asked because they don't see what they're looking at. Her badge reads D. Ross, RN. The cracked mug in her locker says "World's Okayest Nurse," a gift from someone who no longer has a pulse. A dying succulent sits on the break room windowsill. She waters it every Tuesday even though it hasn't shown green in 7 months. When she reaches for supplies, her scrub sleeve rides up to reveal keloid scars across her forearm, white and rigid against brown skin, the kind that don't come from kitchen accidents or childhood falls. They come from shrapnel. They come from a place most Americans will never see and fewer still will survive. The 0300 shift is coded purple, understaffed and overflowing. A trauma alert crackles through the overhead system. 2 minutes out. Danielle's hands move before her mind catches up. She's already running supplies, already positioning the bay, already knowing exactly what will be needed because she has done this 43 times in a place called Helmand Province where a trauma assessment that takes 5 minutes here has to happen in 90 seconds or the patient doesn't walk away. Her fingers brush the faded 2nd Battalion patch sewn into the interior lining of her jacket, hidden where only her fingers can find it during shift change. 5 faces in that photo. Only 2 still alive. The ambulance doors burst open. A 52-year-old construction worker, crushed arm, blood loss already significant, vitals trending wrong. The attending, Dr. Marcus Hayes, arrives with 3 residents trailing behind him like remoras following a shark. Hayes is competent. He doesn't need her to do anything but monitor and report. She monitors. She reports. She watches the residents miss the early signs of shock because they're focused on the obvious injury, not the subtle ones. Her mouth stays closed. The patient stabilizes enough. Hayes clears out. Danielle finishes the documentation and moves to the next bed. This is how she survives. This is how Major Danielle Ross becomes just another competent float pool nurse who takes extra shifts without complaint, who never speaks above a whisper, who never corrects a doctor, who never suggests anything that might make her stand out. 3 years of invisibility. 3 years of watching people die from preventable mistakes while she charts vitals and dispenses water cups. Dr. Ashford arrives for morning rounds at 0640, still wearing last night's cologne mixed with the smell of expensive hotel coffee. He's 48, ambitious, the kind of man who sees every interaction as a stepping stone toward a regional director position that requires more politics than medicine. His surname opens doors. His family knows people. His surgical outcomes are respectable if you don't ask too many questions about the patients who never made it to surgery in the first place. He moves through the ER like he owns it, because in his mind, he does. Danielle is restocking the supply cart when she notices him stop at Bay 6. A veteran, maybe 65, admitted at 0200 with complaints of persistent headaches and irritability over the past 3 weeks. The chart notes some memory gaps, difficulty with concentration. Simple stuff on paper. Danielle has already spent 10 minutes with this patient because the waiting room was full and she'd pulled vitals herself. Notice the tremor in his hands. Noticed how he had to ask her 3 times which hospital he was in. Noticed the way his pupils seemed slower to react. She wheels the supply cart closer without appearing to. Not hovering. Not inserting herself. Just positioning. Ashford reads the initial assessment, scans the vital signs, and moves to discharge him. Tension headaches. Stress. He needs sleep, not hospital admission. Get him a script for muscle relaxants and call him a cab. Danielle is reaching for gauze when the words leave her mouth. Soft. Respectful. Deferential. Dr. Ashford, has neurology screened for traumatic brain injury? The symptom cluster, headaches, irritability, concentration issues, TBI presentation can look like simple tension. The room doesn't freeze. No one stops working. But Ashford's hand stills on the chart. He turns to look at her, and his eyes move across her scrubs like she just materialized into existence. A float pool nurse. A woman whose job is to take orders, follow protocols, and maintain the hierarchy. A woman who just suggested, politely, carefully, but still suggested, that his clinical judgment might be incomplete. His voice comes out smooth as diesel fuel. Nurses focus on vital signs, Ross. Diagnoses are my job. Understood, doctor. She returns to the supply cart. She doesn't argue. She doesn't push. She simply moves forward with the steady competence that has kept her alive for 3 tours and has kept her invisible for 1,095 days in Raleigh. The veteran gets discharged. The script for muscle relaxants is written. Danielle watches him leave, watches him struggle with the automatic doors because his coordination is off by maybe 30%, and says nothing. But Ashford doesn't forget. That's the thing about men like him, they remember challenges the way other people remember insults. He stands there with the chart in his hands, watching the float pool nurse return to her routine, and for the first time, he sees her as something other than background noise. He sees her as a problem. The thing about problems is they need to be managed. Danielle clocks out at 0700. The parking lot is still dark, rain threatening from the east, the kind of weather that rolls in off the Atlantic and makes everything feel heavier. She sits in her Camry for 8 minutes before starting the engine. Her hands are steady on the steering wheel. They're always steady. Muscle memory taken over years of keeping people alive while explosions happened in adjacent rooms and the smell of diesel and copper became as familiar as breathing. She touches the patch through her jacket. 2 fingers. A ritual. A prayer to people who can no longer hear prayers. The rain starts just as she pulls out of the parking lot, hammering the windshield like applause for decisions already made. Back home, to the small rental house on Maple Street where the walls are thin and the landlord doesn't ask questions about women who work overnight shifts and don't seem to have families or friends or any life outside of work. She showers the hospital smell off her skin. Makes coffee. Watches the morning news without seeing it. Watches her phone in case anything happens. Watches the clock count down to her next shift like it's a ticking bomb. What Ashford didn't understand, what he couldn't understand because he'd never been the lowest person in any hierarchy, never had to calculate 17 steps ahead to keep breathing, was that questioning his judgment in front of junior staff was forgivable. Nurses questioned doctors every day. The system tolerated it. But Danielle had done something worse than question. She had demonstrated knowledge that exceeded her station. She had revealed something that shouldn't be visible. That's when everything changed. The overhead pager crackled at 11:02 a.m., cutting through the noon rush like a blade through gauze. Danny the Band-Aid girl to administration. Danny the Band-Aid girl. The words hung in the fluorescent air. Laughter rippled through the ER, a sound like wind through broken windows. Nurses exchanged glances, the kind that lasted exactly 1 second too long. Everyone knew who they meant. Everyone heard it. Danielle set down the 4-pump she'd been calibrating and walked toward the administrative wing with her spine straight, that measured breath that takes exactly 3 seconds to complete. Her scrubs were pristine. Her hands were steady. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the kind that comes from surviving 43 combat saves in Helmand Province, from holding a radio operator's intestines in your hands while helicopters screamed overhead, from knowing that breaking here meant losing everything. She walked past Bay 4, past the medication station, past the eyes that pretended not to watch her go. Dr. Ashford waited in his office doorway, his white coat draped over his shoulders like the robes of a minor aristocrat. His face held that particular expression of someone who'd just discovered a new toy. He was tall, the kind of tall that filled door frames, with the kind of jawline that could cut glass, and eyes that moved like a predator calculating distances. When he saw her approach, he didn't step aside. He simply smiled and waved her in with a gesture that belonged in a royal court, not a hospital administrator's office. "Ah, Miss Ross." His voice moved like a tank idling in a garage, all power, no hurry. "I trust you heard the announcement." She said nothing. Silence sometimes speaks louder than any response. "That was to demonstrate reach," he continued, leaning against his desk with the easy confidence of someone who'd never had a consequence in his life. "You see, when a nurse questions a physician's clinical judgment in front of residents, in front of patients, it creates a certain atmosphere. Uncertainty. Doubt." He paused. His smile didn't waver. Sacred Heart has a waiting list of applicants who understand hierarchy. Very long list. Very qualified people. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? Danielle met his eyes. She didn't blink. "Good," he said. "We'll have no more incidents. No more questions about my medical decisions. No more suggestions that you know better. Because the next time you forget your place, Miss Ross, you won't find yourself reassigned. You'll find yourself unemployed. And a terminated nurse from Sacred Heart, well, that's the kind of reputation that travels." He stepped closer. 8 inches from her face now. She could smell his cologne, something expensive and sharp, like synthetic flowers over rotting wood. She could see the small scar on his left cheekbone, probably from a golf accident, probably a story he'd told at cocktail parties 1,000 times. "Do we have an understanding?" he asked. She took one measured breath. 3 seconds, the way she'd been taught in Kandahar province when the mortars started falling and panic was a luxury you couldn't afford. A single tear traced down her left cheek, not from fear, but from the weight of it all, the crushing absurdity of standing in an air-conditioned office while men in Helmand Province were still bleeding out under stars she'd never see again. She wiped the tear without breaking eye contact. Without flinching. Without giving him a single second of satisfaction. "History remembers what we do when no one's watching, Doctor." The smile on his face wavered. Just for a moment. Just long enough for him to realize he'd made a miscalculation. But then it came back, harder than before, because men like Ashford always recover their arrogance. It was their armor and their god. "Get back to your floor," he said, turning back to his desk with the dismissive wave of someone removing trash from his office. "And Miss Ross?" "The next page you hear won't be to administration." The supply closet came 2 days later. Danielle was restocking gauze, 4x4 pads, sterile, the kind that absorbed blood with mechanical indifference. The shelves smelled like antiseptic and something else, something chemical and flat. She'd learned to appreciate these small moments of order, these brief seconds where medicine made sense in its exact categories and measurements. The door opened. Dr. Ashford slipped inside with the casual ease of someone who'd never been told no. The fluorescent lights above buzzed their mechanical song. The closet was roughly 6 feet by 8 feet, lined with supplies stacked on every wall. There was nowhere to move. There was nowhere to go. Nurses who forget their place find themselves unemployed, Miss Ross. His voice was softer now, which made it infinitely more dangerous. "That's not a threat. That's an institutional fact. Do you understand the difference?" She continued restocking gauze. Her hands moved with the steady precision of someone who'd performed this task 10,000 times. Left hand reaching. Right hand placing. Breathing in. Breathing out. "I'm speaking to you." He moved closer, his presence making the air pressure change in the confined space. "You questioned my clinical judgment. You suggested, and I want you to hear how absurd this is, you suggested that a veteran in my ER might have a traumatic brain injury that I somehow missed. Me. A board-certified trauma surgeon with 43 years of clinical experience. You." Danielle turned to face him. The shells pressed against her back. His face was 8 inches from hers. Close enough to see the capillaries in the whites of his eyes, the small indentations where his jaw clenched, the absolute certainty that he was untouchable. "One nurse, Miss Ross. That's all you are. One nurse among thousands. Invisible. Replaceable. Forgettable. He leaned closer. Sacred Heart has a waiting list. Very long. Very eager. Do you understand what it means to be this easily removed? A single tear traced down her cheek. She didn't blink. She didn't look away. When she wiped it, her hand was steady as a surgical laser. History remembers what we do when no one's watching, Doctor. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then he stepped back, opened the supply closet door, and left without another word. But something had shifted in that moment. The tear wasn't weakness. The steady eye contact wasn't submission. He'd seen something in her that didn't match the title of nurse. He didn't understand what. But he'd seen it, and it had scared him just enough to make him escalate. The parking lot came at 7 p.m., during shift change when approximately 60 staff members were coming or going. Danielle stood beside her 15-year-old Honda Civic, a car that had been old when she bought it, the paint faded to the color of old nickels, the interior smelling permanently of black coffee and pine air freshener. Her reassignment papers were in her hand, printed on the hospital's official stationery with the kind of finality that decisions carved into stone possess. Effective immediately. Dr. Ashford's voice carried across the parking lot like he was addressing an auditorium. Miss Ross has been reassigned from charge nurse to permanent float pool status. This allows us to better utilize her skill set across all departments. He smiled that smile again, the one that belonged to men who'd learned early that cruelty was a language everyone understood. Perhaps she'll learn something about institutional respect. He left her standing there while her colleagues filtered past, nurses she'd trained, nurses she'd mentored, nurses who suddenly couldn't quite meet her eyes. The weight of 43 combat saves, of holding together people who shouldn't have survived, of being the only thing standing between lives and death, all of it settled over her like the dust of Kandahar, like the grit that got into everything in Helmand Province and never quite washed out. She looked at the papers in her hands. Float pool. No department. No consistent team. No schedule she could control. Every shift a stranger's rules. Every day a new group of doctors who'd never know her name, never understand what she could do, never see anything but the word on her badge. A single tear traced her cheek. She wiped it without breaking composure, without letting anyone see the fracture beneath the surface. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened next, because even as she stood in that parking lot watching her career dissolve into administrative paperwork, Sacred Heart ER was about to witness something that would change everything. 30 seconds. That's all it took to change everything. The general collapsed at the Raleigh Convention Center during a recruitment speech. 247 civilians recorded it on their phones before paramedics arrived. Active duty 2-star, full military dress, blood pressure already dropping as they loaded him into the ambulance. The radio crackled ahead, inbound priority 1, elevated VIP status, requesting all senior staff standby. Sacred Heart as Trauma Bay lit up like a runway. Nurses repositioned equipment. Technicians wheeled in the ultrasound machine. The overhead paging system went silent, a deliberate pause that meant everyone was listening. Dr. Ashford's voice came through, measured and commanding, trauma activation. Incoming 2-star general, ruptured splenic artery, ETA for minutes. Danielle was restocking the supply closet on the 3rd floor when she heard it. She didn't move. She didn't react. She simply set down the stack of sterile gauze and listened as the hospital beneath her shifted into a different frequency. 15 minutes ago she'd been a float pool nurse, invisible, beneath notice. Now something was happening that would change the entire hospital's calculus. The general arrived in a chaos of motion. Security detail first, then paramedics, then the stretcher with a man whose face had gone the color of old concrete. His blood pressure was 78/50ths when they wheeled past the nurse's station. Danielle saw the numbers on the monitor as he was transferred to the main trauma bay. She'd seen that presentation before, in Helmand Province, in a fire base called Sanjin, in the faces of Marines who didn't have much time left. Dr. Ashford moved through the trauma bay like a ship changing course. He didn't touch the patient. He didn't order immediate surgery. Instead, he stepped back and began making decisions that weren't decisions at all, they were calculations dressed in medical language. He turned to Dr. Marcus Chen, an attending surgeon with 23 years of experience and 3 kids in college. "What's your comfort level taking this case?" Chen's jaw tightened. "A 2-star without a trauma specialist backup? That's malpractice suit waiting to happen, David. You know the statistics. So that's a no." Ashford moved to the next surgeon without waiting for clarification. Dr. Patricia Holloway, a resident with a fellowship offer pending from Johns Hopkins. "You want to take this?" Holloway looked at the monitor. "I'd rather wait for Duke to send their trauma team. That's the right call medically." "Agreed." Ashford made a note on his clipboard. The word no never appeared, but it was written in the space between his pen and the paper. He moved through the trauma bay with the precision of someone who'd done this calculation before. 5 doctors gave variations of the same answer. The liability was too high, the risk to their careers too steep, the professional calculus too brutal. A 2-star general meant media attention. Media attention meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant every decision would be examined, every outcome measured against impossible standards. None of them said no directly. They all said it with their silence and their reasonable objections. 6 more doctors deferred to something that looked like authority. Ashford had orchestrated this perfectly. He'd told them earlier, "I'm recommending we wait for Duke's trauma team. They have the subspecialty support." When he asked them directly, they nodded. They accepted his decision as though it were gospel delivered from above. The hierarchy was intact. The order was maintained. Nobody had to think, they just had to follow. Then 4 more doctors walked away entirely. These were the ones Ashford had cornered in the hallway before the general arrived. He'd been efficient about it. "If I hear that any of you are considering taking this case, we'll have a conversation about what it means to be part of Sacred Heart's leadership team. I have 3 board members on speed dial. All 3 have very strong opinions about career advancement and institutional loyalty." The message was clear. The threat was structural. Danielle stood at the periphery of the trauma bay, visible but not noticed, in that space where float pool nurses occupied less reality than the 4 stands. The general's blood pressure had dropped to 70/45. The monitor's rhythm was steady, but the numbers were deteriorating at the speed of mathematics. His heart rate was climbing to compensate. His body was shutting down one system at a time, rationing oxygen to the vital organs, performing its own triage. She counted silently. Chen, no. Holloway, no. Dr. Raymond Kim, no. Dr. Susan Vasquez, no. Dr. James Patterson, no. That was 5. Then the 6 who deferred: Dr. Michael Torres, Dr. Angela Weeks, Dr. Robert Hayes, Dr. Nathan Cross, Dr. Lisa Chen, Dr. David Marino. Their names were being written in some ledger that history kept, and they would never know it. Then the 4 who'd been threatened walked past the open trauma bay doors without looking in. Danielle recognized one of them, Dr. Elliott, who'd mentored her in her first month at Sacred Heart before she learned to make herself small. He kept his eyes forward. His shoulders were tight. Ashford had broken something in that hallway, and Elliott was carrying the fracture. 15. Exactly 15 refusals, distributed across 5 categories of cowardice: the career-conscious, the deferential, the threatened, the complicit, the compromised. The general's pressure dropped to 65/40. The security detail was shouting now, not at anyone, just at the situation, at the unfairness that a man who'd spent 40 years protecting the nation was now in a building full of doctors who'd decided he wasn't worth the risk. One of them, the woman with the bearing of someone who'd made hard decisions in harder places, kept saying the same phrase: he needs surgery. He needs surgery now. Ashford was on the phone. Danielle could see his face from where she stood. He was performing for the audience of his own authority. We're providing comprehensive care by waiting for Duke's trauma team. Specialized support ensures optimal outcomes. The words were correct. The logic was sound. The patient was dying. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. 62/38. The ventilator hissed beside the stretcher like a mechanical ghost. Ashford had begun his second series of calculations, moving people around the board like a chess player who knew he had superior position. She watched him signal to one of the OR nurses, saw the nurse nod, saw someone being pulled away from OR2 where a routine appendectomy was scheduled. The attending anesthesiologist who'd mentored Danielle in crisis ventilation was being reassigned to cover the appendectomy. It looked random. It was engineered. Then Ashford turned to the duty roster board and made 3 entries with a pen that moved like a scalpel. Danielle saw her name. Saw it being moved. Saw the allies she'd quietly built over 3 years of careful work being dispersed to different floors, different shifts, different universes of the hospital where they couldn't help her. The general's face had gone a different color now, not gray but something closer to the color of a person whose time was being measured in minutes. The security detail was quiet now. They knew. In the way that people trained in combat always know, they understood that the moment was becoming a memory. Danielle closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. In that darkness, she was somewhere else. A phi base called Phi Base Shank. A lieutenant named Reeves with a presentation just like this, pressure dropping, time running out, 40 minutes until a helicopter could reach their position. She'd had a Ka-bar knife and a bottle of betadine and hands that moved like they'd been training for this moment her entire life. She'd cut through the peritoneum and found the bleeder and held it while she worked. The lieutenant had lived because she'd made a choice. She opened her eyes and looked at the janitor's cart in the hallway. She could see the maintenance knife clipped to the belt of the custodian restocking supplies. She could see the general. She could see the 15 empty spaces where doctors used to be. Pain is data. Scars tell stories. Hands that had held lives together don't forget that work. Danielle took one measured breath. She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She moved toward the trauma bay, and nobody stopped her because she was still nobody, just a float pool nurse grabbing something from the supply station. But her hands were already steady. Her mind was already calculating. Her body was remembering things her mouth had never spoken. The general's blood pressure had dropped to 60/40ths when she reached the door. The sound of the cardiac monitor seemed to grow louder, not the beeps themselves but the space between them, the rhythm that was accelerating toward silence. Somewhere in this hospital, 15 doctors had chosen their careers. Somewhere in this hospital, a 2-star Marine general was running out of time. And somewhere deep inside a float pool nurse who'd been trained to disappear, a major who'd served in Helmand Province, a woman who'd kept a faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining for 3 years, a choice was being made. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't even the part that changed everything. The moment that actually mattered came when she reached for the janitor's cart and looked at Ashford's face and understood, with the clarity of someone who'd already survived the worst, that she was about to become visible. Pressure dropping. 85. 80. 75. The monitor's rhythm became a countdown, each number another second Danielle couldn't afford to waste. 15 doctors had already looked at the Marine general and found reasons to say no. 15 men and women in white coats had chosen their careers over a 2-star's life. She watched the most recent one, Dr. Chen from Cardiothoracics, walk away shaking her head, muttering something about protocol, about specialists, about the liability of operating on someone this visible without backup. That made 15. Not one of them stayed. Not one of them looked back. The general's wife stood frozen at the ICU window. His daughter in dress blues had called her commanding officer and left a message that never would have sounded more controlled if her father weren't dying. Ashford stood near the admitting desk speaking to administration in that measured voice of his, the one that made people think he was being reasonable when he was actually ensuring every possible escape route was blocked. He wasn't shouting. That would have been honest. Instead he was creating the conditions where no one could help, then documenting that no one had. Danielle turned away from the monitor. Muscle memory didn't ask permission. It didn't check the hierarchy or count the witnesses. It simply recognized that someone was going to die and that her hands had saved 43 Marines in worse conditions than this, had held blood vessels steady through artillery fire, had sewn skin back together by the light of burning vehicles in Sanjin Valley. Her hands knew the answer before her mind finished the thought. She moved to the crash cart without announcing herself. The betadine bottle sat in its tray, rust-colored, antiseptic sharp even through the plastic. She grabbed it. The percussion cap came free with a soft crack. Her fingers moved with the muscle memory of Helmand Province, of pre-op protocols that had nothing to do with hospital hierarchy and everything to do with survival. Swab the chest. Small circles. Eradicate the visible bacteria. Create the sterile field. The chemical smell rose up, cutting through the recycled air like a blade. She didn't pause. Didn't check Ashford's face. Didn't wait for permission that wasn't coming. The janitor was in the hallway outside the trauma bay, pushing a supply cart with the kind of casual indifference people develop after 20 years of being invisible. His name tag read Marcus. He'd worked Sacred Heart longer than Danielle had been alive. Marcus, she said. One word. No question mark. He looked up. His eyes registered something in her posture, something that shifted from nurse asking for something to person who had made a decision. Yeah? I need your maintenance knife. He didn't argue. The blade was 8 inches, curved slightly, the handle worn smooth from years of cutting drywall and opening boxes in the supply room. He handed it over without a word. She met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for gratitude, long enough for acknowledgement, and said, I'll return it. You're gonna save him? Marcus asked. Yes. She didn't explain how. She didn't detail the procedure or cite statistics or apologize for the breach in protocol. She simply turned back toward the trauma bay and moved past Ashford as though he was furniture. The general lay on the table with his abdomen exposed, the prepared field waiting, his blood pressure at 63/40. Brain tissue dies at 60. She was already past the point where hesitation was possible. The knife went in beneath the left costal margin, a 4-inch incision through skin, through muscle, through the thin wall of the ribs. No time for cauterization. No time for assistance. Just the knowledge that the splenic artery was bleeding somewhere in the space between the stomach and the diaphragm, that 14 pints had already left his body, that his heart was working at 1,000 beats per minute just to keep any blood reaching his brain. The rib spreader came from the surgical tray. She didn't remember asking for it. A young resident, maybe 28, eyes wide, jaw locked, was suddenly passing instruments without waiting for requests. He'd understood what was happening before Ashford did. Stop her. Ashford's voice hit the ceiling. Security. Remove that nurse immediately. But her hands were already inside the chest cavity. Muscle memory didn't debate. The lungs folded back. The heart visible now, beating with the desperation of an organ trying to keep a body alive it could no longer reach. The splenic artery was a dark line against the surrounding tissue, already darkening further as it continued to bleed. She controlled the bleeding with finger compression first, direct pressure, the oldest technique, the one that worked when everything else failed. The hemostat came from somewhere. The resident again, sliding it forward with the precision of someone who'd trained in a trauma unit instead of reading about one in textbooks. Clamp, she said. 2 syllables. Not a request. The young doctor placed it. She crimped the vessel with a movement that felt like typing. Her hands had done this 43 times before. The bleeding stopped. Just like that. The pressure inside the chest normalized. The heart slowed from desperate hammering to something approaching a rhythm. Danielle worked the temporary shunt into place, creating a bridge for blood flow while the damage was assessed, while the surgery could be completed properly once the patient reached Duke. Her hands moved through the procedure the way other people walked. No hesitation. No drama. Just the mechanics of keeping a human being alive long enough to reach someone with more resources. I'm calling the board, Ashford said. His voice had shifted. No more commanding tone. Something closer to panic, controlled only by force of will. I'm documenting this as unauthorized surgery by unlicensed personnel. Security, stand by. But he didn't physically stop her. Couldn't, without killing the general himself. The patient was stabilized. The transfer to Duke could happen now. The critical window had closed, had slammed shut around Danielle's wrists like a handcuff made of blood and muscle memory. 2 hours later, the general was in the ICU with a Duke surgical team who took over the final repairs with the kind of gratitude that only appeared when someone handed you a patient who should have been dead but wasn't. Danielle was in the employee locker room removing her scrubs. Ashford had called the floor supervisor. The supervisor had called security. Her employee badge, 5 years of working this ER, of being invisible, of being reliable, was already deactivated. She could hear them coming before she saw them. The 2 security guards were professional about it. They didn't touch her. They just stood in the doorway and waited. She finished changing into street clothes and opened the locker that had held her lunch bag and 3 backup pairs of shoes and the photograph she looked at exactly once per shift, during her break, when no one was watching. The cardboard box came from the break room. She packed it with the methodical precision of someone packing for deployment. The cracked mug was first, white ceramic with black letters reading "World's Okayest Nurse," a gift from Patricia 2 years ago, meant as humor. It sat in the box like an artifact from someone else's life. The succulent came next, edges browning, roots probably already dead but still clinging to the soil with the stubbornness of something that wasn't quite ready to surrender. The photograph was last. 5 faces. Her fire team from Helmand Province. Corporal Martinez with the crooked smile. Sergeant Holloway with the scar that split his left eyebrow. Lance Corporal Chen. PFC Rodriguez. And her, younger, thinner, someone who believed in things like chain of command and honorable service. Only 2 of those faces were still alive. The rain started as she stepped outside. Western Boulevard was slick with it, the kind of rain that fell hard and fast and didn't apologize. The bus shelter 3 blocks away had a broken panel, the one on the left side where wind found gaps and water dripped despite the roof. She stood under it anyway, holding the cardboard box, her scrub soaked through to the jacket underneath. Underneath that jacket, hidden in the lining, was a unit patch. Faded. 43 bloodstains that had never quite washed out, each one a name, each name a weight she carried without acknowledging. She could see the 9 p.m. bus route coming down the street, its headlights cutting through the rain like searchlights. It would take her to the studio apartment on Maple Street where the landlord never asked questions and the neighbors were the kind of people who understood the value of being invisible. Where she could sit in the dark and remember faces. Where no one would call her Major. No one would call her anything at all. But that wasn't the part that changed everything. The next moment didn't arrive on the bus route. The hospital security detail had already run her fingerprints through the system as a matter of protocol. Anyone who touches a 2-star general gets checked. The routine background check had flagged something that made federal databases light up like Christmas. A classified security clearance level. A name that officially didn't exist. Orders that had been signed by someone 3 ranks above the hospital's CEO. The kind of thing that didn't just arrive with a phone call. The kind of thing that showed up with uniforms and badges, and the kind of patience that came from knowing you held all the cards. She heard the vehicle before she saw it. The rain muffled most sounds, but not the sound of a Black Hawk setting down on the hospital's helipad. Not the sound of specific people making specific decisions. Not the sound of history deciding to stop sleeping. The security detail ran her fingerprints at 3:44 a.m. Routine protocol. Standard protective sweep. The machine hummed for 14 seconds, not unusual, not threatening, and then flagged. Red line crossed the screen. The sergeant's jaw tightened. He looked at Danielle standing there in her scrubs with the coffee cup stain on the left shoulder, hair still damp from the OR, and radioed upstairs without breaking eye contact. "We need federal notification on this one." She didn't flinch. She'd been waiting for this moment for 4 years. The hospital's background check system, the one that took 90 minutes to clear bartenders and housekeeping staff, suddenly escalated. Classified clearance level. Pentagon flag. Not a suggestion. Not a request. An automatic lockdown that required federal intervention before the hospital administrator could even process what was happening. The chief medical officer received a phone call at home. Then another. Then a third from someone whose name couldn't be said aloud over unsecured lines. Within 40 minutes, the hospital's security protocol shifted from standard to compartmentalized. Danielle was moved to a private office. Water. Chair. Silence. The general security detail waiting upstairs would have their own procedures. Their own questions. Their own files. But the general's daughter arrived first. Captain Maria Ross, 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, call sign Bravo 2, walked into that hospital like she owned it. 28 years old. 5'9". Combat boots polished to a mirror shine despite the 4 a.m. hour. She wore her dress blues and her bearing like weapons, and when she found Danielle sitting in that office with a security officer standing outside the door, she looked at the officer and said, "You will address her as Major." Not a question. Not a request. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The officer's radio crackled. He stepped outside. Maria closed the door and looked at her older sister, the one who'd disappeared into the ER nursing pool 3 years ago, the one who sent emails with redacted lines and phone calls from numbers that didn't exist, the one who'd been erased from every record the Marine Corps could legally erase, and for the first time since the Sanjin Valley, Danielle let someone see her face without the mask. "You saved a 2-star general with a maintenance knife," Maria said. Not anger. Not accusation. Just fact. That's going to be difficult to keep quiet. The head nurse arrived next, clutching a partially declassified file with both hands like it might explode. Patricia Ing had worked at Sacred Heart for 19 years. She'd trained Danielle as a new graduate, watched her move through the floors with precision and composure, never suspected the truth. Now she stood in that office with trembling hands, actual trembling, the kind that comes from realizing you'd been standing next to legend your entire career, and whispered the words she'd read 3 times because they didn't make sense the first 2 times. 3 Purple Hearts. Her voice cracked. Navy Cross. She looked at Danielle like she was seeing her for the first time. The Delta Force liaison arrived at 4:33 a.m. Major Tom Graves, 1st SFOD Delta, credentials that made the hospital security stand down immediately. He shook Danielle's hand with the grip of someone who'd held weapons with that same hand for 20 years, and he named them aloud so everyone in that room would understand. Silver Star for the Sanjin extraction, 2009. Bronze Star with Valor for the Marja offensive, 2010. He paused. His eyes held hers. "Those are field decorations, Major. That means the worst day of your life earned medals. That means you saved people nobody knew were there." Patricia's hands stopped trembling. They just dropped. Then Dr. Ashford walked in. He was still in his hospital coat. He'd been paged. He'd answered. He'd come to the secure office thinking this was about the surgery, about defending his protocol, about proving that Danielle had acted without authority, and he saw the uniform. Not hers. His. The uniform of everyone in the room who wasn't wearing a hospital badge. Federal. Military. Classified. His face didn't just go pale. It drained of color like someone had opened a valve and let all his confidence bleed out onto the floor. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded like it was coming from very far away. "What did I do?" He knew. He understood in that moment, standing in a room with a 2-star general security detail, a Marine captain, a Delta Force liaison, and a classified service record, exactly what he'd done. He destroyed the career of a decorated combat medic. He'd humiliated her on overhead paging because she questioned his judgment about a veteran with TBI. He'd cornered her in a supply closet and threatened her employment. He demoted her in front of 60 staff members. He'd watched her perform emergency surgery on his patient and called her a rogue nurse. He'd done all of it to someone with a silver star. The silence that followed was like the silence between lightning and thunder. Everyone in the room could hear it coming. The JAG investigation that Ashford had demanded, the one he'd called for specifically to expose Danielle's negligence and protect his reputation, became something very different once federal investigators opened his files. 16 cases in the past 18 months. Uninsured veterans turned away from the ER with fabricated discharge diagnoses. For cases where he'd altered patient charts to hide substandard surgical outcomes. Documentation he'd created to protect himself became the evidence that destroyed him. The detailed notes about Danielle's insubordination. The emails to board members describing a rogue nurse. The reassignment orders he'd issued to isolate her. All of it. Every line he'd written to shield himself from accountability became the trail that led federal auditors directly to his worst decisions. Sacred Heart's veteran care protocols entered federal audit on a Wednesday. The board received the initial report on the following Tuesday morning. By 2 p.m., Ashford was escorted from the building by security while his office was packed into boxes. His medical license entered review by Friday. The colleagues who deferred to his authority suddenly claimed they'd suspected something was wrong. The board members whose connections he'd leveraged distanced themselves in official statements. His lawyer told him the malpractice suits would take everything he had and everything he'd ever have. 2 months passed. Danielle visited the strip mall on Capitol Boulevard on a Tuesday afternoon. She wasn't looking for him. She was just driving home from Sacred Heart after her shift, and she saw the banner strung between 2 folding chairs. Ashford Insurance Solutions. The letters were printed on white vinyl. His photograph was on the banner, a headshot from before, from when he still had authority, from when he still believed the hospital was his kingdom. He was sitting behind a card table. Alone. No one was there. No clients. No customers. Just him and the banner and a stack of pamphlets that nobody wanted. Their eyes met across the parking lot. She reached toward the outside of her jacket, where she'd finally sewn the faded 2nd Battalion patch so it was visible to anyone who knew how to look, and touched 2 fingers to it. Not a salute. Not a gesture for him. Just an acknowledgement of something that mattered more than his career, his reputation, his insurance solutions. History. The kind that gets written when people choose duty over self-preservation. Then she kept walking toward her car. She didn't look back. There was no need. Some people are erased from history because the world forgets them. Some people are erased because the world finally remembers. Ashford was learning the difference. 2 weeks later, Danielle stood at a podium in the hospital atrium. The general was there, fully recovered, skin color returned to normal, the Meritorious Service Medal already pinned to his jacket from the ceremony last week. His daughter stood beside him in dress blues. The hospital staff filled the space below the stage. The new chief of surgery, a woman who'd spent 3 years in a Navy field hospital, sat in the front row. The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical song. The antiseptic smell of safety hung in the air. "I didn't save the general's life because I'm special," Danielle said, her voice steady as a laser. Not loud. Just audible. "I saved it because walking away wasn't an option. It never is. Not in Helmand Province. Not here." She touched the patch on her jacket. The faded green emblem of 2nd Battalion. The history that nobody could erase because it was finally being witnessed. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. The applause followed her down from the stage, but she was already thinking about her charge nurse shift starting in 40 minutes, about the patients who needed her hands to be steady, about the work that doesn't stop for medals or ceremonies. If you've made it this far, you already know why Danielle's story matters. You already know what it means when someone chooses duty over safety, when someone holds their ground against impossible pressure, when someone refuses to let history erase them. Subscribe for more stories about people nobody expected to save everything. Like this video. Comment below, What would you have done in Danielle's position? And if you know someone whose hidden strength deserves recognition, share this.